All right, here we are. End of year. I wish that I could turn this camera around and like actually point it at my desk so you can see all this stuff instead of my wife's station behind me. Oh boy. Charmed life, right? And we got a viewer. What's up, everybody? Timeout length. Got it. We're gonna wait just a minute to let everybody get filtered in here. It has been a very busy year, and I'm going to try to be quick about these because 170 books, let me tell you what, at the beginning of the year, that's not really what I was setting out to read. The amount changes from time to time. Last year, I only read 76 books. I say only because it is a lot easier to read high volume when you're doing audio. That's just a fact. And I've had discussions with people about that. There are some that adamantly think like it doesn't count as reading if you do the audiobooks. Like, yes, it does. Like if you can do an accurate book report about it, then it counts, right? But if I read 100 audiobooks and somebody else reads 100 print books, we're going to have two kind of different experiences with it. You get different things out of it, and it is easier to read audiobooks. It takes a lot less effort. But I'm working 55-hour weeks on average, and when I'm home, I'm either trying to be present for my family and trying to be productive on my own end. And my job is really isolated and solitary, so it just makes sense to read audiobooks that way. It's it's that, or I'd be listening to podcasts or listening to music. Like we're all kind of in this era of constant flow of entertainment, and I'd rather dedicate a significant amount of time to doing audiobooks because it's more edifying than just listening to noise or whatever. So all right, well, we're about 2 minutes in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Trying to rearrange some stuff here so I can get the microphone closer. And oh geez, can tell my kids have been playing with my desk. All right, I'm going to get this link out. Dadgummit. Put this out on Twitter. Everybody get in here. And let me hop in the Discord with my friends. Okay, here we go. The 170 books that I have read this year. I just finished the last one today. I did a couple of videos early on about, I'd get to the end of the month and I'd do a recap video about that. I eventually moved that over to my Substack. And so some of these, if you caught those videos earlier this year, they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, he mentioned these. Like I said, I'm going to be very brief here. We'll recap it kind of month by month. January, I read 15 books and I abandoned 3, which will happen from time to time. I read God Emperor of Dune. I was supremely bored with that one. My general takeaway on the Dune series is that I like the first 3 that Herbert wrote. I don't really care for anything that comes after that. It's just too much. Into the Light by David Weber. That was the sequel to Out of the Dark, space aliens versus vampires type thing. Hogs in the Sand by Buck Wyndham. That was a very, very good memoir from a man who had fought in the Gulf War. Hell and Back by Craig Johnson. That was the new Longmire book, or one of the newest ones. I read 2 of those Longmire books. That was me getting caught up. Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. That was the first of the Secret Sanderson projects and probably the best of the 4. An Honest President by Jeffers. That was a biography of Grover Cleveland, which I did not expect to enjoy as much as I did. Fascinating time, and to date, the first president that we've had who served non-consecutive terms. And we've got another president looking to do that right now. So, interesting. The Magnificent Nine by Lovegrove. That's a Firefly novel. There's a series of Firefly novels that tie in with the TV show that examine plots that never got turned into episodes. So I'll pick one of those up every now and then. I reread Lost Planet Homicide, and then the new version or the new story in that series was Ghosts of Zenith by Korea. Quick and the Dead by L'Amour. I've read that one before. I thought that I'd forgotten it, and then I went and read it, and I was like, oh, I have done this one before. I'd forgotten which particular one that was. Old Gods Waken by Manly Wade Wellman. Somebody recommended that, I think, in the Writer Dojo group. I'd never read anything by this author before, but I want to read more. It's like old Appalachian witchcraft type thing. American Muckraker by James O'Keefe. That's the guy formerly of Project Veritas and now of the O'Keefe Media Group. That's a guy who, he does journalism as it should be done, and he's risking his own neck doing it. Warlord by Doc Spears. That's a very, very heavily influenced by John Carter of Mars type series. That one was good. The second one was a little bit briefer, and it's kind of easy to get in the weeds on them, but I like the way that it's written. In Defense of the Second Amendment by Larry Correia. Incredible piece of nonfiction that really accurately lays out the state of gun laws and gun culture, as it were, in the U.S. And The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy. I've taken a few runs at reading Clancy before. I tried him once in high school, and I just was not meshing up with it. And then I tried again about 10 years back. I listened to Patriot Games. And I kind of got a little bit more out of it, but Hunt for Red October was a highly enjoyable read. And then my wife and I went and checked out the DVD from the library and watched the movie. And I was like, okay, this is this is a lot of fun. This is good stuff. The three that I didn't finish, one of them was a graphic novel by Joe Benitez, the seventh of the Lady Mechanica series, and that's the one where I kind of parted ways with that series. There's a premise. She's basically like an amnesiac steampunk cyborg. We're 7 volumes into this series, and we're not getting any closer to resolving the amnesia. It's something that's it's constantly being teased at you, but there's no resolution to it. It's like Lost. You never really get answers to questions, and I'm out. I don't do that. Elmore Leonard wrote a book called Maximum Bob that looked like an interesting piece of parody's the wrong word, but just tongue-in-cheek kind of humor comedy about a corrupt judge down in Florida. But the content was not my thing. And then this is gonna surprise some people, but the Coming of Conan by Robert E. Howard. I've got a lot of friends that love Robert E. Howard and especially love Conan. I've tried reading Conan stories a couple of times. I just can't get into it. For whatever reason, I read it and it's like, this is not my thing. Nothing against it. It's just I've tried and I can't. So those are the 3 that I abandoned in January. In February, I finished 16 and abandoned 1. And that one was kind of notorious. And since there's not a lot of people watching this, and there probably won't be, we'll get to that at the end of this month's report, but I'll tell you which one that was. First book I finished was Empire of Silence by Chris Rocchio. That was a reread. I'm going through that series again. He's got his own tone and everything, but he's very reminiscent of Herbert in his writing. There's a lot of comparisons too between the Sun Eater series and Dune. Bass Reeves, which was it was an anthology of stories written by mostly Oklahoma authors about the famous lawman. It was all right. I read fictionalized seems wrong, but kind of like a novelized biography of George Washington Carver by Bengi. That was fascinating. I didn't know a lot of the extra details of that guy's life. 47 Ronin, that was a graphic novel by, no, wait. Was that one? I feel like I read 2 books about the 47 Ronin, and one was a nonfiction and one was a graphic novel. This one I'm labeling it as a print book, so it must have been the graphic novel. That's a crazy story in Japanese history, but a very moving one. Forced Perspectives by Tim Powers. I love Tim Powers. I don't really care for that particular series of his. Horus Rising by Dan Abnett. This was my first run at any of the Warhammer books, and I liked it, but I am very in over my head with the lore on that series. And that was the first in a kind of a sub-series that dealt with one of like the larger overall lore movements. I realized there was a lot of context that I just didn't have. So I'm reading some different Warhammer novels before I go back and try to understand everything going on in that one. But I'm really liking them. Call Sign Valkyrie, that was, I believe that was a Wargate Books collaboration. It was fine. Crucible by Rodriguez. That was, I think, like a YA sci-fi type thing. I remember very little about it. It left a low impression. Arsenal by Jeffrey Haskell. That's me rereading a series that I'd read before. I think I've reread now the first 3. It's about a girl who's kind of like a combination of Batgirl and Iron Man. She's paralyzed. She's in a wheelchair, but she's like a super genius, and she builds an armored suit, and there's superheroes and stuff. It's a good piece of superhero fiction. The Californios by Lamore, kind of a run-of-the-mill Lamore story. Even his middling ones, they're 3 stars. They're fine. Like, it's not one that I'm going to go back to. Wide Ops by Declan Finn. That's one of Declan's, like, it's a space opera series. It's like if Declan was writing Star Trek, but there was like a crack commando team. That would be Wide Ops. Lesser Devil by Chris Rocchio. That's in the Sun Eater series, but it's a novella. Nemesis by Cruzy. That's the 3rd of the Mammon novels, and I need to do a video about the Mammon trilogy because it's a banger. Holy cow. Red Planet by Heinlein. That was incredible. I'd actually never read that one. It's got nothing to do with the 2000 movie. There was a Fox Kids cartoon from the 90s that was loosely adapted from it, but the book was awesome. I read a Ghost Rider Volume 1. There's some new run of graphic novels by a writer named Percy. It was meh. And then Weightlifting is a Waste of Time by somebody named Jake Wish. That was just a book written by a guy who was trying to sell some weird rubber band exercise equipment that he made. Kind of irrelevant. All right, the book that I did not finish. Earlier this year, I did a rant driving home from work in the car, and it ended up becoming like one of the more famous videos that I've done on YouTube, where like I hate lit RPG, and I was like, this genre sucks. Why does it even exist? People need to stop writing these books. Like, I've read a fair amount of lit RPG, and most of it sucks. And this one book, it just absolutely broke me. And I wasn't going to list which one it was, just because, like I said, I'm not out to start crap with anybody. But since this is going to be buried in a live stream, we'll see who actually checks it out. This is a small reward for the few of you that are going to be watching this. The book was called Something by Dakota Kraut. It was the first in the Full Murder Hobo series. Cool title, cool looking art and everything. You get into the book, and it's just this guy walking around in circles grinding for experience points. And after like the 8th or 9th or 12th hour of it, I was ready to just put my head in the oven. So done with it. And that's the book that made me infamous amongst the YouTube lit RPG community. So there it is. In March, I read 18 books and abandoned 3. The first book I finished was Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. He's one of those Ancient Aliens, Netflix archaeologist type guys. That sounds kind of dismissive, though, if you're doing like a fair description of who he is and what his work is. He does get into some weird stuff, but he does present interesting and compelling pieces of archaeology that are not so readily dismissible, and changes your perspective on the potential age of the world and the quality of civilizations that have lived here before the ones that we know about. Full Metal Superhero number 2 by Jeffrey Haskell, Caterpillar by Travis Corcoran. That was it's like Killdozer meets The Walking Dead. Good little short story. He's writing a series out of that now. Hellspawn by Declan Finn. That's the first in the St. Tommy NYPD about a Catholic detective in New York who literally fights evil, and he's got sainthood endowed upon him by the angels, and he's out fighting evil. Howling Dark, that's the second Sun Eater book by Rockio. Patrick by Stephen Lawhead, an historical novel about the origins of St. Patrick. I did a video on that. Great book. Splashdown by Blaine Pardo. That's a mecha series by a guy who he used to write Battletech novels, and now he writes his own thing. I've done a write-up of that for Upstream. Napoleon by Bell. That was a biography about Napoleon. It wasn't extremely comprehensive, but it gave you a good 30,000-foot view of his life. A Short Stay in Hell by Sorensen. Oh boy, that was if somebody was trying to write an actual version of hell that would terrify you, I think that was the one to do it. It's a short story. It's worth the read. A Case in Oak Haven by Jake Westbrook. Jake and his brother McLean run a YouTube channel called Yesterday Today, where they showcase old radio shows and vintage 40s music. And they're into that era and that aesthetic. And Jake wrote a private detective story, kind of also set in that same era. And I bought it. It was pretty good. Again, 47 Ronin by Alan. This was the audiobook. It was a longer, nonfiction that explained what that whole saga in Japanese history was. Warlord 2 by Doc Spears. Read the sequel to that one. Congo by Crichton. Read that one in middle school, and I enjoyed it well enough back then, but rereading it now is man, this is better than I gave it credit for. A lot of people might only remember that movie from the 90s that had a bunch of lesser known actors in it, but ignore that and go read the book. It was worth it. And then I also read The Great Train Robbery by Crichton. Had a lot to recommend it. Had a couple of things to not recommend it, but I thought that was a fascinating showcasing of his talents and his versatility, and a compelling blend of fiction and non. Saving Faith by John G. That's a bit of a dry nonfiction, but very, very valuable, and it made one of it got one of my best of year designations. True Believer by Jack Carr. That's the second in the Terminal List series. Really, really liked the first one. I was at about, I gave this one about 3 stars. I need to read the third one. I think it's Savage Son. Foxman by Gary Paulson. I remember nothing about it. And Grimm's War #1 by Jeffrey Haskell. It's the same guy who writes the Full Metal Superhero. Grimm's War is it's set 900 years in the future in a space navy. I've done a write-up of that one on Upstream as well. That one's really good, and it's probably his most successful series to date. And for a guy who makes his bread and butter doing indie publishing, that's saying something. The 3 that I abandoned were Shadow Hunter by Matthew Reeves or Michael Reeves or something. It was a Darth Maul graphic audio thing. I didn't get into it. Aeronauts by James Glacier. That Amazon movie that they made with Eddie Redmayne and who was the actress? I can't remember. About they're flying a hot air balloon way high up in the air. I didn't watch the movie. I heard that it took a lot of historical liberties. Obviously, the female character didn't exist in the original story. The story itself, this book, was really just a collection of journal entries with a lot of dry data on, we flew up here, the temperature was this on this day. I abandoned it. And then the final one was a cyberpunk police thing called New Tokyo by an author named Fox, which wasn't bad, but it felt like something that I'd read a lot of before, and I couldn't get into it. In April, I read 16 books, and I abandoned one. I read Residue by Steve Diamond, which was fine. I did a video on that one. The second of those Sanderson projects came out, The Frugal Wizard. a lot of people that I know really liked that one. I gave it 2 stars. I could not give a crap about that one. It was a frustrating experience. I'm gonna do a video, recapping my assessment of those 4 Secret Sanderson projects, because I came to some unexpected conclusions by the end of it all. Colonel's Daughter by a guy named Hurt. I could not remember what that one's about. And this is what happens when you read this many books in a year. Codex Babylon by Rob Cruzy. I remember liking it, but I also remember being really confused by it. And it was one of those where I got the, I got the impression that I need to read that one in print instead of audio, because it's a time traveling mystery type thing. And I feel like he references a number of events and places and people that I'm not entirely familiar with, and that I would need to be able to look those things up in real time in order to get the full context of the story. I backed the trilogy on Kickstarter because I trust Rob's writing, and I've got to reread the first book before I then go and read the second two. Courage to be Free. That was, Ron DeSantis. Anybody who's running for president writes a book, and the library had that one, and I decided to check it out. And this was before he announced, and I got to the end of it. It's like, yeah, this dude's going to run for president. And, lo and behold, here we are. Tower of Silence by Larry Correia. That is the 4th Son of the Black Sword book, which, now I've read that entire series this year. The first 3 books I have now reread. Tower of Silence was an incredible follow-up, and I'm excited to see how he ends it. Tin Can Tommies by a guy named Jones. I wrote a review for that on Upstream. The Fall of Gondolin by Tolkien. That's one of those books that's like, it was a chapter in the Silmarillion, and then now it's its own book, because he wrote so many versions of it, and Christopher compiled and collated it all into one book. Easy Go by Crichton. That was one of his more disposable pulp novels that he wrote when he was in college or med school. Red Rising by Pierce Brown. That's a reread. I've read that series now like 4 times in 10 years. Riptides by Blaine Pardo. It's the sequel to Splashdown. Dead Ringer by Lamore. Another one of those kind of middle of the road books that he wrote. It's one of those, like, I'll read it and I'll kind of forget about it. It doesn't, for me anyway, it doesn't really stand out above the rest of his work. Top Gun by Peterson. That was about the origins of the military weapons school, the Navy weapons school, whatever it's called, the Top Gun program. Xenos by Dan Abnett. It's another Warhammer novel. It's in a different series than the Horus Rising book, and I'm actually reading that again right now for the second time, and really, really enjoying it. If I understand right, according to the rumors, this is about the character that Henry Cavill is going to play when they adapt Warhammer for streaming. Riding the Roller Coaster by Carlos Hyde. That's about the history of the Chrysler Motor Company. And then Norwood by Charles Portis. That's the guy who wrote True Grit. This was another book of his that the library had. And it was kind of one of those like mid 20th century, guy bumming around in a car and just kind of like living life cheaply and poorly, and, makes friends, loses money, meets a woman, that kind of thing. It was like the prose was good and everything, and it was an atmospheric novel. It's not one that I'd be like running to recommend to anybody, but hey, I read it. The book that I abandoned was Dead Man's Hand by Butcher. That's Jim Butcher's son, and it just felt like a run-of-the-mill genre piece. I wasn't able to really get into it. In May, I read 14 books, didn't abandon anything. Some Danger Involved by Thomas. What the heck? I'm remembering that title, and I'm remembering the general concept of it. I'm not remembering. What the frick was that? Okay, you know what? We're going to look this up in real time. Let's see. Some Danger Involved, Thomas. Who's messaging me on Twitter? Go away. Yes, you will. Barker and Llewellyn. Okay, now I remember. My wife recommended this one to me. It's a series it's like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, not Sherlock Holmes, but it's very, very Sherlock Holmesian. I ended up getting the first book in that series for for my mom for her birthday or for something. Yeah, my wife really liked that, and so I checked it out, and yeah, it's very like Holmes and Watson, but it's extremely well done. I need to read more in that series. History Decoded by Brad Meltzer. This is a list of 10 conspiracy theories. Seems like the wrong word, but it's big events in history where what we've been told doesn't completely stack up with evidence that we have, and those events might have happened in a different way than we're commonly led to believe. The most significant piece that I got from this book was the idea that John Wilkes Booth might have survived being burned out in the Garrett farm in Virginia 2 weeks after he killed Abraham Lincoln. If you've read my novella Sic Semper Tyrannosaurus, you understand why that's relevant. Reading this book gave me the missing piece that I needed to write that short story. So just fantastic. 68th book of the year was Inescapable Arsenal by Jeffrey Haskell. That's the third of the Full Metal superhero books. 69th was Redemption by Will Jordan, aka The Critical Drinker. This is the second book of Drinkers that I've read. I really liked his Dark Harvest book. I was really lukewarm on this one. It felt like a generic like a thriller piece about like, oh, CIA agent who gets in over his head and has to go rescue somebody, and like it was a Tom Clancy book. But if you're going to write a Tom Clancy book, you need to find some way to distinguish yourself from that kind of book, and I don't really think that he did. For a guy whose YouTube content and stuff like I really love, and I appreciate the cultural contributions that he's made to the critical arena. I respect the fact that he's still willing to put skin in the game and put his own art out there to likewise be critiqued. And in all honesty, this one was a book that like didn't really do anything wrong. It just didn't really rub me the right way either. It was what it was. Wager by David Grann. This was the second Grann book that I've read. In fact, the third of his that I read, I just finished today. This is the same author who wrote Killers of the Flower Moon. And this book was also a nonfiction. It was a little bit less of it focused on a less compelling story than Flower Moon, but Flower Moon was a very unique story compared to the other things that he could have written about. This was about a naval mutiny in the 1750s. There was a ship that set sail from England. It crashed off the coast of Chile. The crew mutinied. Half of them made it off the island and sailed back to England, and then a year later the other half made it off the island and sailed back to England, and they ended up in court over who did what and who was responsible for mutiny and all that stuff. That was his newest release of this year. Wraithbound by Tim Akers. That was a substantial epic fantasy. I'm pretty sure I reviewed that on Upstream. Skin Map by Stephen Lawhead. Okay, so I read this book in 2010, and he's finished the series now. I wanted to reread it to get into the series. I remember having the same experience this time that I did last time, where it starts very strong. The first 2/3 of the book are strong, and then the final third, it's like, ooh, I'm running out of steam. Excuse me. And that's made it hard for me to go back and read the next 4 in there. I eventually will, but I'm not going to force myself to muscle through them in quick succession. The Black Prism by Weeks. That was a book gifted to me by a friend, and it was a very drawn out epic fantasy with a compelling piece of world building and some good character conflict. I didn't fall head over heels in love with it, but if I'm going to get into an epic fantasy series, I'll probably go back and read the second one of that. Turquoise Serpent by Alexander Palacios. That was recommended heavily amongst a group of people that I follow on Twitter. I read it and I'm remembering almost nothing about it now, so I should probably read it again. Drive by Salas. Why did I check this book out? It's I gave it 5 stars. It's the book that the Ryan Gosling movie is based on, and it's one of those that it kind of comes out of nowhere, and it's a very prosaic, like almost literary novel about a guy who's a stunt driver in Hollywood, just living on the hard edge of life, but making good choices along the way. And I was like, okay, I can see why the Sigma Boys meme on this movie if it follows the book closely enough. Really, really liked the book. And then I read Grimm's War 2 and Grimm's War 3 by Haskell. Shoot the Devil, that was an anthology that I reviewed for Upstream. Basically a bunch of Christian warriors that go and use weapons to shoot evil in the face to death. And then Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. That's the second Red Rising book. That finishes up May. All right. Getting us into June. June was the shortest reading month of the year because I'm pretty sure I got more into music podcasts. And sometimes I've read so much, you get not even to the halfway point, you've already read 80 books for the year. It's like, okay, crap. Like sometimes I'll try to decompress my brain by just listening to some lighter fare before I go back and do another book. Book 80 was Cobalt Red by, what was this guy's name? Siddharth Kaur. It was about the cobalt and metal mining in the Congo, and how it's like the conditions are just absolutely awful, and the demand for those metals is getting higher and higher with the push for greener technologies, which are way worse for the planet than anything petroleum is going to produce. Very eye-opening read. Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier. That's about the transgender craze that's resulting in tens of thousands of child mutilations every year. You should read that one. Monster Hunter Memoirs Grunge by Larry Correia and John Ringo. That's the first of the memoirs books. That was me rereading that one. Just fantastic, highly entertaining. The third Mercury book by Rob Cruzy. That one was good. Haunted Mesa by Lamore. I'd never actually finished that one, so I did that one this year. It's a little bit more of a magical realism piece by him. Morning Star by Brown. That was the third Red Rising. Scott Howard. This was a hard read. The transgender industrial complex. He was just connecting a lot of dots between like how did this thing suddenly become this big medical industry overnight, what laws enabled it, and what got us to this point, basically. Very heavily researched. Like I want to say maybe a quarter of the overall page count is bibliography and indices and resources and stuff. Like holy crap. And then the last one was Dark One Forgotten. I think it's Dan Wells writing in a world that Brandon Sanderson created. That one sucked. I hated it. Don't read it. And then the one book that I didn't finish was He Who Fights with Monsters by Shirtaloon. That's a lit RPG book. So, I did that lit RPG video in February. It took off. And a lot of the fans of the genre in the comments were recommending things that I could read that were better than the unnamed book that I'd gotten frustrated with. And this was one of the titles that got the most play, like the most recommendations. He Who Fights with Monsters. I bought a copy. I read about a third of it. It wasn't working for me. I was running into a lot of the same problems that I had with other books of the genre. But I appreciated the guys that didn't just come in swinging like, oh, how dare you hate this, and you're just being mean, whatever. First of all, it was a rant on a bad day, as I've said, but the fans of the genre that want to get more people into it were doing good work to get me there. That wasn't the book to make me like lit RPG, but that will come later. In July, I read 11 and bailed on 2, but those 2 were rereads. I got like a significant of the way through them, and I was like, yeah, pass on the rest of it. I was just, again, like sometimes I get into these spells of almost mental fog where I've read too much and I just need to decompress. The Crossing by Kevin Eikenberry. I did a review for that on Amazon on Upstream. That's about some West Point cadets that end up teleported back to 1776, and they've got to participate in the crossing of the Delaware and stuff. 9 Princes in Amber by Zelazny. Can't remember who recommended that one. Older piece of like kind of magical realism fantasy. Didn't really care for it one way or the other. Lost Treasures #1 by Louis L'Amour. Okay, so I'd been reading that one since Christmas because my wife got me this book for Christmas. I was slowly picking my way through it because it's 19 pieces that he started writing or outlining or whatever. And I would read one of them, then kind of like set it down and digest it, and then go to the next one. This made my best of year list. And then I've got Volume 2 that I bought right here, but I haven't started reading yet. I'll talk more about those later because I could go on quite at length about them, but just incredible. And then I reread Iron Gold. That's the 4th Red Rising book. I read Johnny Tremaine by Esther Forbes. That's a great July book to read. 93rd book that I read was an Animorphs book, one of the ones that I hadn't read before. Like I said in my Animorphs video earlier this week, I got to like the mid 30s. There are like 60 books in that series overall, and I got all the way to like book 35 before I stopped reading them in high school. But now that my son is reading them, I was like, okay, well, let me get back into it and finish the series. And so I read a couple of Animorphs books this year. American Prometheus by Bird and Sherman. That's the book that the Oppenheimer movie was based on. And it was interesting to get a lot of information about his life, like just the raw information. There was also a fair amount of writer opinion coming in, and it's colored by the fact that the authors are communist apologetics. They write for The Nation, which is a communist outlet, and they were, big Oppenheimer proponents and defenders, as one might expect. But yeah, they came to some conclusions that aren't completely defensible about whether the man actually was, right to have had his security clearance revoked. It would be another, long saga all on its own. But there are a couple of other books that would make for good reading on the subject. War on the Run by Ross. This is one that'll fly kind of under your radar unless you know who Robert Rogers was in that Turn Washington Spies series that AMC did all those years ago. He was a character in that. He was the he's the big granddaddy of the U.S. Army Rangers today. Like they still follow a lot of the what's the word that I'm looking for? Edicts that he made, the rules that he made about like these are the Rangers rules, do this, do that, do the other thing, and like they still live by those rules today. Like he invented this particular type of American warfare suited to the American terrain. Reading about his life was fascinating. I really enjoyed that book. Tiberium Wars by De Candido. That was, if you're a fan of the Command and Conquer video game series, this was a tie-in novel. This was an endurance test for the fans. Like you would only have read this and gotten to the end of it if you were a big fan of the Tiberium Wars games, which I am. This is not a good book. Gabe El-Taib wrote a graphic novel called Truth, Justice, and American Way. It's like an off-brand DC Trinity. Like this guy is not Batman. This guy is not Superman. This lady is not Wonder Woman. The art was good. The story was no more complicated than you would expect it to be. It was fine. I probably won't be reading a sequel. And then Dark Age by Brown. That's the one that I got like 90% through it. And I was like, okay, I remember now. Put that one down. It's the worst book in the series. And that surprised a lot of Red Rising Bernie bros on YouTube because I think it was the first time that they ever encountered a contrary opinion to anything in their lives based on how they reacted to me saying that. But it is what it is. It's a terrible book. And then I read Lightbringer, which was the 6th one, which did come out that month. It did a lot of things better than Dark Age, but you get to the end of this 30-hour audiobook, and the characters are basically no farther along than they were at the beginning. And that's not even like a debatable point. It's factually accurate. Like hardly anything has changed between the beginning of the book and the end, and that was exceedingly frustrating. The final book on there, which was another one that I didn't read all the way through, was Raptor Red by a guy named Bacher. I did a video on that one. It's a guy writing a book from the perspective of a dinosaur based on what he knows from paleontology. And that gets us through July. Into August, I read 13 books and abandoned one. The 100th book that I read for the year was The Unknown Soldier by Jace Killen, which was another thriller piece. Okay, so I was talking about, Drinker, for example. Like he's writing a Tom Clancy novel, but he wasn't really doing anything to distinguish himself from Clancy. Like he was basically just writing a store brand Clancy. Jace Killen's Unknown Soldier is an example of how to write something that is like a bread and butter piece for the genre, but how to stand out. And that's largely based on the story that he gave to his central character. You know, the main character is a kid whose dad was a government operative. Um, the kid didn't know. He saw his dad do some things that, you know, drove him mad, drove him into drugs. He was a drug user. He did some things that he ended up going to jail for. While he was in jail, he learned skills and made contacts, and all those things made him beneficial to the government. He ends up going and working for the government, solving financial crimes, but he's got to deal with the fact that you know, he's technically an addict in recovery, and he doesn't want to slip up and get into substance abuse again, and he wants to take down the guys that you know, enable those kinds of crimes in the States. So adding that character dynamic is what would make a book like this stand out from others of its kind. And Jace Killen did a great job with that one. I would read a sequel for sure. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. That was the third of the Secret Sanderson projects. It was better than the second one. It was not as good as the first one. It's one of those where Sanderson's setting, I think, was more fascinating than his story, which as a reader, I'm noticing that more and more with his work. Don't at me, bro. Just me saying that. Book number 102 is Monster Hunter Memoirs Fever by Larry Correia and Jason Cordova. That was another of the memoirs books, but the first in a new trilogy, and I really enjoyed that one. 103 was Time Trial by M.A. Rothman and DJ Butler. I bought that one in March and finally got around to reading it in August. That was two incredibly smart, well-read historians, like putting their brains together and just pouring it all into this time travel adventure that was pretty gonzo. There's a lot going on in that book. I read the fourth Mercury book by Rob Cruzy, which was, I think, the best of the series. Well, maybe the first one was the best, but this one was a very strong contender in that series for best of. 105, I reread Son of the Black Sword. I did a recap on the channel. 106 was Warrior Poet Wade. That was one of those that maybe I did a recap of that on my Substack. It's one of those books that it was basically like full of good life advice for people who need it, but it also seems like a lot of the stuff that I've been hearing at church my entire life. So it didn't feel like it was entirely new to me. It's fine for what it was. Planets Volume 1 by Yuki Mura. That was a graphic novel that made Best of Year. I did a video about that. Fablehaven #1. I'm rereading that one because it's another series that my kids are really getting into now. So we're going through those with them. 109 was A Bad Place to Be a Hero by Westinger or Westinger. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It was, I substacked that one. It's a book that like it didn't have any problems with it. It didn't do anything wrong. I just didn't care. Book 10 was ISOM #2 by Eric July. That one came in. Liked it. Did a video on that one. 111 was Vain Pursuits by R.C. Bruno and Jamie Castle. That's the one where I got to the end of it and it's like, I'm not really going to worry about reading this series anymore. 3 Years at Quantrill by McCorkle. That was... What was that one? Was that a Civil War memoir? I think it was about a Civil War unit. I'm drawing a blank on that installment. And then the one book that I didn't finish all the way was Inheritance by Christopher Paolini. It was the only one of the Aragon books that I hadn't read, and since there was an Aragon book coming out this year, I figured I'd check it out. I grabbed a copy from the library. I listened to a fair amount of it, and then I was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to get all the way through this. So I looked up the Wikipedia summary for what I needed that was relevant. Excuse me. September, I read 15 books, didn't abandon anything. Ice and Monsters by Paul Nealon. That was, like a bunch of military operators go sailing through a storm into Norway, and they come out of the storm on the other side in a world full of monsters and like Vikings and stuff. Necromancy the Musical by Debbie Hibbert. That was the first book that I covered when I did the Brother Trucker Book Club revival. It's a good piece of YA. It reminds me of when YA was good. Impact Winter by Beecham. That was an audio production that was included in the Audible library and started strong, and then it just decided to go full suck, and not because it was a vampire book. Hacking Galileo by Fenton Wood. Incredible. Best of year book. Dungeon Crawler Carl by Dinneman. That was the one that the Lit RPG Bros recommended. That was awesome. Give it 4 stars, and I'm going to read the second one, probably third one in 2024. Rhymer by Frost. That was a big, long historical fantasy. It's a Bane book. It was fine. I wasn't over the moon about it, but it wasn't like super boring or anything. The Longmire Defense by Craig Johnson. That was the Longmire book that came out this year, and you don't really this is the first time you really find out about Walt's grandpa, and he's got beef with him, and he's handling a case where his grandpa might have done something wrong that he's got to square with. House of Assassins by Larry Correia. That's the second Son of the Black Sword book. Did a recap video on the channel. Tombstone by a guy named Clavin. That's a nonfiction about Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, the town of Tombstone, all that. Did a video there. Phoenix by Lori Janeski. That one was good. I enjoyed it, and I knew that my wife would really like it. Recommended it to her. She dug it. Smoke Eaters by Grigsby. Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, pass. Self-Defense Principles by Andrew Branca. Law of Self-Defense Principles. Where do I have that one? Right here. So Branca is a YouTube lawyer, and I should do a video on this one. I say YouTube lawyer, and that kind of paints the wrong picture. It's not that he's just some goof on YouTube. He is an actual attorney with experience in this particular field. And I first found out about him when Rekieta was streaming the Rittenhouse trial, and he had a lot to weigh in on. He specializes in self-defense law. Excuse me. And he wrote this book, which is very plain and easily digestible, and a very compelling read. If you want to know what the law is, what the principles are that the law is based on with regards to self-defense, read it. Very much worth it. All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sakurazaka. This is the I can't even know what time of reading that is. I've read that one a couple of times before, and it's great. Love Chi Monster Phantom. That's the Czech MHI anthology that I still need to do a video on. We'll call that one a underwhelming experiment. The Google Translate thing, it worked for the most part, but you lose a lot in translation, and I didn't find it as interesting as a lot of the other MHI stuff. No Traveler Returns. That was a semi-autobiographical novel that Louis L'Amour wrote back when he was a steamship sailor. It's kind of a novelization based on his experiences. And, while the through line of the story doesn't really, move me or anything, the smaller components of it remind me of certain elements of my life, truck driving and spending too much time at work and not being home with my family. I think there was a lot to recommend it on those grounds. But that was the final book that I read in September. How are we doing on the stream, guys? What's everybody's 2 cents? Wow, 48 minutes in. Okay, well, we got 3 months left, and this is going to go a little bit faster now. All right, so October, I read 15 books, and I abandoned 1. Book 128 was Blacklisted by History by M. Stanton Evans. Joseph McCarthy was done dirty, by the government and by the we'll say education department ever since then, that has painted a very inaccurate picture of the man. He went hunting for communists, and he found them because they were there. I would just say that he was really too late to defeat them. The October Country by Ray Bradbury. That was the first time I'd finished that particular anthology of kind of short horror stories. Regia Occulta by Dan Abnett. That's a Warhammer short story about Eisenhorn. It takes place before Xenos, before the first book in that series. My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. That's the first time that I've read one of those Wodehouse books where there aren't really arcs or anything. It's just the charm and the prose is the value of those stories, and they're very light and enjoyable and pleasant reads. Pluto Volume 1 by Urasawa and Tezuka. That is a a robot manga that I've read the first 2 volumes of, and I am thoroughly enjoying. 12 Nights at Rotterhouse by J.W. Oker. Worst book I've read this year, and I will never read anything by this guy again. He can suck it. Haunted Night by Jeff Loeb. That's a graphic novel prequel to The Long Halloween, which is one of the more iconic Batman graphic novels out there from the 90s. Very, very good. Storm Surge by Blaine Pardoe. That's the third of the Land and Sea books, those mecha books. Project Noten. I'm not tired, I promise. Project Notebook by Jason McQueeston. First book that I've read by Jason. And I enjoyed that one. I tried doing a video on it a while back, but I think like the audio got corrupted or something, so I should probably do one again. The Will of the Many by Islington. This was, this is a book that if you've read the Red Rising books, the algorithm will try to force this one on you. And, not without cause, because if you read the description, it sounds very much like Red Rising. It's even set in a, we'll say like a Roman Empire-esque type setting where everything's got names, and our main character is a plucky lower class guy who's in disguise and trying to take down the Imperium from within, and it's written in first person present tense. Like, it's got a whole bunch of stuff that makes it similar on the surface to Red Rising. The first couple of chapters were very compelling and interesting, and then it just hits this brick wall of slog that it never climbs off of, and it became boring as hell, and it sucked. I don't recommend it. I don't understand how the average rating is like 4.5 out of 5 stars with 5,000 reviews. Complete catfish. My Brother's Keeper by Tim Powers. Yeah, I read that one. I think you'd have to know a lot more about the Bronte sisters to really get like the full value out of that one. The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm by Paolini. That's a collection of 3 short stories set in the like the Aragon universe. Death Planet by N.R. LaPointe. Awesome. If you like Dino Riders, go read that book. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'd never actually read that one before. Beautiful piece of classic literature. Seems wildly different from any adaptation that Hollywood has ever made over the years. Honor at Stake by Declan Finn. I did a video on that one. Hot Catholic libertarian and hot vampire team up to kill bad guys. The one book that I didn't finish was The Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher. I'd read that one back in 2015, and the second one just came out, 8 years later, and I was like, okay, I'll reread this one to see if I remember it and get ready for the next one. And then I was like, nah, I'm just not into it. November 14 books, and November I read 14 and I didn't finish one. The first one that I read was Wilding Hall by Elizabeth Hand. On that video about 12 Nights at Rotterhouse, this was the book that I read to kind of cleanse the palate, and it was fantastic. Sunlit Man by Sanderson. That was the 4th and final Secret Sanderson project. 3 stars. 145 Murtagh by Christopher Paolini. I enjoyed that one way more than I thought I would. It was fun to get back into that world. I did a video on that one. Tracking Spirit Bear by Ben Michelson. I wrote about that one on the Cracker Stack. I'm surprised that one isn't better known. I think it's better than it gets credit for. That's one where the like average rating on Goodreads was like below 4 stars, but I read it and I was like, this should be higher. This is a good book. Here Shall I Die Ashore by Caleb H. Johnson. That's a biography of Stephen Hopkins, and gives you a lot of details about the Mayflower voyage that you don't get in other books. Brian's Return by Gary Paulson. That's a reread. How to Build a Car by Paul Newey. I'm not quite sure what I expected from that one. It's a biography of one of like the premier Formula One racing engineers, and his time working with different motoring teams. Gives you a good insight into what that life is like, and the role that engineering plays. It's not just the pit crews and the driver and all that. Like, the engineering is hugely critical. Ghost of Spirit Bear by Ben Michelson. That's a sequel to the Touching Spirit Bear. They were both short audiobooks, so I read them more or less back to back. Brian's Winter by Gary Paulson. I've been reading that book for 25 years now. Pluto Volume 2 by Urasawa and Tezuka. And then The Long Halloween by Jeff Loeb, which was really, really well done. You can tell that Christopher Nolan drew on that heavily for the Harvey Dent arc in The Dark Knight. And then in that most recent Batman movie, they pulled from that to kind of establish what they were doing with the Riddler. In the Time of Dinosaurs, that's an Animorphs book by K.A. Applegate. Jupiter Knife by D.J. Butler and Aaron Michael Ritchie. That's the sequel to The Cunning Man. I thought The Cunning Man was fine. I thought this one was better. And then, the one book that I didn't finish was King Philip's War by a guy named Schultz. It was... I only didn't finish it because it was like 1/3 of it was a narrative and the rest of the book was like a reference and a list of places where different events in the war happened. So it was good. It just didn't make for like good through line reading. And that brings us to December, where I read 14 books and I abandoned one. I read another Animorphs book. I read Up on the Housetop by Brad McBride. Destroyer of Worlds by Larry Correia. That's the third Son of the Black Sword. Faking Christmas. Okay, so this is funny. So one of the girls that I worked with at a bookstore way back in the day, she's kind of like committed to being a promoter of like rom-com books, like clean romance books and stuff. And so like I see her making recommendations all the time. And of course, December rolls around and she's like pimping about a dozen of these run-of-the-mill Christmas romances. But one of them sounded good and the library had it. So I grabbed it, I listened to it, and the main character dude is this like just absolute Chad, wears flannel, writes books, and he teaches at a middle school or something. And the main character girl is like in denial that she's totally hot for this guy because he wears flannel and writes books, as all women are, you know. And so there were a lot of overlaps between their story and certain character traits that my wife and I have. So I bought her a copy of the book after I read it, and she devoured it in like a day, and she got a huge kick out of it. So that was a lot of fun. Rudolph by Ronald Langford, did a video on that one. A Lone Star Christmas by William Johnstone. This is a guy he's a contemporary and he's writing Westerns. He's like the big name writing Westerns right now. And that was the first of his that I read. It was very, very good. Hork-Bajir Chronicles, another Applegate book. Alpha Core #1 by Chuck Dixon. That one came in. I really, really enjoyed that one. I think it's the best Rippaverse book so far. A Christmas Spark by Cindy Steele, same author who wrote that Faking Christmas book. The library had all of her stuff. It wasn't as good as the other one. Ben-Hur by Lou Wallace. I wrote about that on the stack. I'd never read it before. The Worst Ship in the Fleet by Skylar Ramirez. Really, really enjoyed that one, and I'll do either a video or an upstream review of it, maybe both. Die Trying by Lee Child. That's the second Jack Reacher book, and I've decided that I'm going to read those, and that one was really good. It handled a subject that could have gone very sideways in the hands of a lesser competent writer. At the Highways of Madness by David J. West. I feel like I'd started this book years ago and never finished it. And, so I got on it again, and it's about a couple of truckers going through Utah that pick up something they shouldn't. And it ends up like infesting their truck with a weird alien presence from another dimension, and weird stuff starts happening. And I've been on all the highways that he names in that book, and weird stuff happens out in the desert. I'll tell you that much. And then the final book of the year that I just finished today, this was the third David Grann book that I've read. It's called White Darkness, and it's about a guy who he's distantly related to one of the crewmen on Shackelford's Arctic expedition or Antarctic expedition. Antarctic. It is Antarctic. It's the other end of the world. Anyway, he's climbing over the ice, one of those guys. And it's a short audiobook. It's only like 2.5 hours long. And the guy who did this did it like back in 2016. And I was like, man, how did I not hear about this when it was going on? Fascinating story. And since it's so short, like I'm not going to say anything else about it. You should read it. But very, very powerful story about, endurance and vision and family and all that stuff. And then the one book that I abandoned was Heretics of Dune. And I think I'm done writing or reading Dune novels. I like the trilogy, and I'll leave it at that. So that is it. That is the 170 books that I finished reading. Bully Cabal Recruit. We got some chats here real quick. We are listening to a lot of Robert E. Howard books in this house right now. If you've got one that you would recommend, other than, like I said, I tried Coming of Conan. If you've got one that you think is accessible, to people who have taken a run at it and not been, really satisfied, let me know. There's a new author named, I say new, he's gaining more fame with his work, Howard Andrew Jones, who, from my friends who read Robert E. Howard, they say that like this guy is really channeling Robert E. Howard with these kinds of like sword and sorcery type books that he's writing, and I wanted to check those out too. So if you got any recommendations, let me know. And then some sound like books we would like around this house. Well, that's I'm glad that you said that, because that's really what I do here, and this will kind of segue nicely into one of the announcements that I wanted to close off this year with. So I've mostly done book related videos on this channel. I've got that piece in my banner: read, write, draw. That's what I talk about. And I've occasionally, dabbled in a few other things, talking about, movies and other forms of entertainment and stuff. And I decided, well, I think I would like to keep the focus of this channel tight and be, a literacy advocacy type channel, recommend books for people, because I read so dang much because of the nature of my work and how easy it is to read audiobooks. So I'm going to keep that focused, but I am going to start a second channel where I can do, shorter, more digestible content that will not necessarily be in this vein, but that will still have some value, just so that I don't bog this channel down with stuff that's just kind of scattered in its focus and all that. Like, I read a ton and I want more people to read. I think that would be the cure for a lot of our woes if people spent more time reading, and not necessarily nonfiction. It took me a while to get to the point where I wanted to be reading nonfiction to the extent that I do. I've been doing like annual tracking of my reading like this since 2008 or 2009, where I write it all on a document and I just keep it on hand. I do have a Goodreads account. I don't really like Goodreads all that much anymore. I could do a video on that one too. But excuse me, I'm trying to keep the pipes lubricated here. I track it for my own self, for posterity, and the tracking methods have gotten a little bit more refined over the years. But the point is, if you go and look at one of my early lists from like 2009, it's 95% fiction, and a lot of it was forgettable, but it was good for me at the time, and it helped me to develop my almost mania that I have now to constantly be reading something. Over the last couple of years, I've really gotten into Mayflower history, Civil War history, Native American history, like a couple of different veins that, throughout the centuries kind of intersect with each other, and just continue to paint a broader picture and fill in the gaps in my own knowledge, which, affects my worldview and my decision-making today. And I think that approach to reading and all that could be really good for people. And then, fiction has its own role to play as well. And that's why I'm always on the lookout for, a good piece of fiction to entertain and to edify and to recommend. So, that's why I do what I do. The last couple of things that I wanted to note here, I got a list of books here that I reread, and then my best of year list. I'm going to do my best of year list in its entirety as a separate video, but the best of year books were Hogs in the Sand, about the A-10 Warthog pilot in the Gulf War; In Defense of the Second Amendment by Larry Correia; Red Planet by Heinlein; Saving Faith by John G.; Tin Can Tommies by Jones was his last name; Lost Treasures Volume 1, Planets Volume 1, Hacking Galileo, Murtagh, and The Tracking Spirit Bearer, Ghost of Spirit Bearer. I'll do a more detailed and like scripted rundown of those when the time comes. And that's it. That gets us to the end of that list. So what is to come for next year? Well, Like I said, at the beginning, I didn't really set out to read 170 books this year. It just sort of happened. And I will probably have a high book count next year as well. But there are some asterisks on that because, as always, it's a lot easier to read audiobooks than it is to read anything else. And while I do occasionally read a long audiobook that takes me a few days to get through at work, more often than not, what I read I can get through in a day, especially if you bump up the speed a little bit. Um, Next year, I'm going to finish all of the Animorphs books that I never got around to reading. And, I'll be doing quick little video rundowns of, the plot of each one. And, after I talk with my son, what was your favorite part, that kind of thing. It gives us something for him and I to do together. But I've got like 20 books left to read in that series. They're short. They're like 3 hours long. You bump up the speed, they're even faster than that. I'm also, like I said, reading the Jack Reacher books, getting those one at a time from the library. And there are 28 of those. And, if I can get through those in a day or two each, then, there's another big chunk. I've got plenty of books that come my way from, small publishers and indie authors that submit it to Upstream. And we can't always get to all of them, or sometimes we'll read it and it's not like, it doesn't really do it for us, so we don't write a review of it. But I am a reviewer now, a part-time semi-professional reviewer. That's what I do. And I wouldn't mind continuing that, but I just hope that I don't get bogged down in stuff that I'm not terribly interested in. I want to keep finding good books that I'm excited about. But I also have a fair amount of capital in terms of time that I have to dedicate to that. I still need to read the 5th Sun Eater book, and then I have a review copy of the 6th one that I need to get to. And those are not insignificant reading. Like I said, Rocchio's channeling Herbert, and that's not just in the quality of his prose or the scope of his storytelling. It is also in his word count. And so that just, it takes time. As far as longer reading projects, I need to finish that George Washington biography written by Washington Irving, which is not insubstantial. I've got a book by Hugh Nibley over here that I'm about 20% of the way through. And then in 2009, for my birthday, my brother gave me a copy of the Landmark Herodotus that I still haven't finished. I've picked at it from time to time. And going back to what I said before, I think I'm at a point now where, because I tried reading this back in the day and it just didn't interest me. But my reading habits have changed to the point where, I can read longer, slower books like that and get something out of them. Whereas before, if I was just reading, mostly fiction, you try to give me a big historical book like that, and it didn't really work for me. So there are challenges that I had to overcome through just the amount of reading that I did over the years. Get bored enough with fast food fiction, you want to read something a little bit more substantial. And I've come to have a better appreciation for nonfiction in the last, 5 to 8 years. So I want to read that one. And I've got a lot of books that I want to read, and it's not necessarily that I'm like, buying books just to turn them into channel content, but I learn interesting little tidbits along the way. And I thought, if I just sit down and talk about this for 5 minutes, I could share it with people and show my excitement for it and show what's good about it and what's valuable about it. And, hopefully impart some of that zeal that I've gained over the years. My whole point in recommending books is to get people as excited about this stuff as I am. And so I do buy certain books and say, okay, I want to read this. I want to know more about this. And then it occurs to me after the fact, it's like, I could distill this down to 1 or 2 points and make a short video about it and share it with people. I am going to reread the Silmarillion next year with a specific goal of condensing it 1 chapter at a time and do a 5-minute video and saying, like, here's the general rundown. Because I think if you give people an outline to follow when they're reading something, it helps them to, work their way through something that's otherwise a lot more complex, which the Silmarillion definitely is. and then that allows them to kind of like digest it and process it more readily, and get more out of it. Especially in today's attention starved world, you got your TikToks that last 30 seconds, the Chinese distraction machine that's there to ruin an entire generation of people. If I write something, if I write a script for something that's shorter and I record it for a video and then upload it and say, okay, if you enjoyed this, go read the actual thing, maybe that'll get people there. I just had a copy of Tolkien's letters show up today. If you guys follow me on Twitter, my @ is, let me put this here in the chat so you can see it. My Twitter account is @TempestMaleo. I tweeted pictures of the book that I just got off of eBay, that 1981 copy of Letters from Tolkien. It's a whole bunch of his correspondence that they acquired over the years and put together in one place. It gives you insights into the man, and he's one of my favorite writers, and obviously one of the most significant novelists of the 20th century, because he wasn't writing like plain literary classics, because he was writing in a specific genre that for the most part he invented. He gets set aside when they're talking about classics, but he's really one of the most significant classicists, I'll say, of any era, but especially of that one. And I want to see what kind of insights and things that I can learn about him and his approach to writing specifically and life in general, and see what things I can share. So I've got a lot of like big hefty books that I want to chew through and share pieces of it here. So if you're watching and you're not subbed, make sure to sub. The channel has grown crazily this year. Most of that is due to that Mayflower video that I did 3 years ago, just offhand, and I loaded it onto YouTube because it ended up being 15 minutes long and I couldn't text the video to a friend of mine. I was seriously recording it on a phone and moving it around. To this day, I still get complaints in the comments. Hold the camera steady. The video's already made, dude. What the hell am I going to do? Anyway, I am probably going to redo that video later this year. I'll keep the original up because it's gangbusters. It's got like 2,000 comments on it now from people that are just learning more about their own ancestry because of it. But the channel crossed 1,000 subs this year, and then in the last month, it has grown just 50% off of what, like, I had 1,400 subs going into November, and I'm up to 2,200 now, and the views on that video alone have more than doubled since Thanksgiving. It's more than any single stretch of growth that I've seen over the last couple of years, and I've had a couple of other videos get into the thousands of views, which is minuscule for people that are able to make a living off of YouTube. But for me, who found success here purely by accident, I am loving this, and I'm loving the growth, and I would love to keep stoking the coals and make this fire bigger, and reach more people, share more books, get more people reading. It is the oldest form, other than verbal storytelling, other than oral tradition. It is the oldest form of imparting wisdom and information from generation to generation, and we are the only species on Earth that does this. And in an apocalypse, when the EMP hits and all the digital stuff fails, it is physical books that we are still going to have on hand. Even if I'm reading 170 books in a year and only 16 of them are in print, I'm still buying way more books than that just to add to my physical library. Books for me, books for my kids, books for my wife and I to enjoy together, books for me to study and mark up. Books, all right? Like if I sat down and added it up, you would see probably a solid 4 figures every year that I spend just casually adding books to my library. And, I find that that's extremely beneficial for me, and like the people that I'm able to coexist with best, we'll say, to live with and work alongside people who have wildly different ideas and ways of living from I do, are the people who read the most. Like we're able to hold a discussion and live in 2 very different ways, but still, wrap our heads around the other person's point of view, because we read broadly. We're able to entertain different ideas and even discard ones that we don't agree with and express why. That is an underrated quality and one that we need more of. I had a government teacher my senior year of high school who, he was a self-professed Democrat, but his wife would also tell him that he was the most conservative Democrat she knew. There is such a thing. He stated at the open house at the beginning of the year, telling our parents, he goes, my goal for this class is, if students don't have personal values, to help them develop and figure out what their personal values are. And if they do already have personal values, to have a reason for those values. And, nowadays that might send up some red flags with people, because if a teacher says that, they might think that, oh, well, this teacher is going to program their values into my student. Like, no, this guy was very objective and critical and helped people to challenge themselves, helped the students to challenge themselves and figure out their own way of thinking and to be able to defend it in a debate setting, which is hugely critical for any, functional government class to work that way. For being a Democrat, when he was introducing us to, different media outlets and figures and stuff, this is, early 2000s, 01, 02 was my senior year. He pulled up a couple of clips that he had on a VHS cassette of Rush Limbaugh's TV show. He briefly had a TV show in the 90s, and he played a couple of clips, and he's like, for a lot of you, this is going to be your first time, being exposed to this guy and his ideas and the things that he says. This is the level of popularity that he has in talk radio. This is his audience and stuff. And there are a lot of people that agree with him. Here's what he says. And it was just a couple of clips of, Rush Limbaugh being his bombastic self and like making political points, but also making jokes and just, saying whatever it was that he says. And at the end, he turns that video off and he tells the students, he goes, okay, make up your own mind about this guy. And, not in like a tongue-in-cheek way. It was, we had kids that were from Democrat families and kids that were from Republican families and a couple of, indifferent and unaffiliated or whatever. But, his idea, his ethos was, I'm going to expose you to this thing, decide what you think about it, discuss it amongst yourselves, be cool about it, share ideas. You've got to fill the well before you get there, though. And that's why I read. That's why I constantly read. I'm very lucky to have my older brother, who is literally a doctor. He holds a doctorate from Claremont Grad School in political philosophy. He's the one that bought me that Herodotus book. He's bought me a couple of books over the years that it took me some maturing as a reader to get around to reading. God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley. When am I ever going to read this? Well, it turns out I read it last year. Herodotus, I found gems in it the few times that I have cracked it open, and I want to read more. I want to read his landmark Xenophon, the landmark Thucydides. There's a lot of those. Like, I have more of an appreciation now for like the classics, not like, stuff from 200, 400, 500 years ago. Give me the stuff from 2000 years ago. I want to know the underpinnings of the world that I live in today. And I want to share that with people. That's what I do here. So Bernard Cornwell. Okay, so Sharp. Okay, so I watched one of those like BBC specials, the ones with Sean Bean, one of those rare screen treatments where he was in something and didn't die. And I thought that was pretty cool, pretty well done. I need to read those. I think I checked out Sharp's Tiger once, but I didn't get around to reading it before I had to take it back. My friend Porter, who is a massive history buff, has been reading Bernard Cornwell for, I don't know, like legitimately decades. So yeah, I'll check that out. I'll put Sharp's Tiger back on the list. Great comment from Ben Kirkham. He goes, it reminds me of Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, where he tells another professor, your job is to destroy prejudices, but mine is to make sure they have them in the first place. Oh, that's our public education system in a nutshell. That title reminds me of a book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind, which was one of the best books that I read in 2019. And it was the first book that really made me realize the generational divide between my own group, the millennials, as it were, and the Gen Z kids. Just let's say it's 2019. Anybody who's turning 18 this year was born the year that 9/11 happened. And, here's what has characterized their entire life experience since then. And he goes and breaks it all down. The invasion of Iraq, Bush's reelection, the Democrats take over Congress in 2006, Obama gets elected, the ACA gets passed, gay marriage gets passed, like Colin Kaepernick kneeling and making a big deal, Donald Trump getting elected, even though it was, supposed to be Hillary from what the media was telling them. Like some of these like extremely massive turbulent events of the early 21st century, which, prior generations are kind of able to take in stride, even though we're standing and looking at it and saying like, oh, this isn't normal. Like for Gen Z, this kind of stuff is normal. And, that shapes then what is extreme to them. And then, on top of that, there's this whole idea of like, praising activism and protest culture. And, if you're not protesting something, you're complicit in it. Like there are things that are completely normal and acceptable to this generation that prior generations would look at and say like, this isn't functional, this isn't how the world operates. And understanding that, like I said, that was the first time that I really was able to wrap my head around the idea that my generation is different from the next one in very significant ways, and there are some things that need to be fixed there. And they'll never understand it. Oh, sorry about that. Until they're able to see that what they're doing isn't working. And how do you make them see that? Share history with them. Show them times when it's already been tried and what happened. Well, we got Jared Garrett in the chat. What's up, Jared? Let me get this reminder out of the way. Coddling of the American mind is brilliant. I quite agree. Dadgummit, why are all my reminders popping up? It's probably because my phone is linked to my computer. Stop that. Go away, phone link. Nobody likes you. That's not true. I like you. I just don't like you right now. Change my approach to political conversations. Yeah, that was really my takeaway from it. I've been meaning to grab a copy and read through it again. It's one of those things that, now that we've been homeschooling our kids for a couple of years, I'd want to talk about it with my wife because it would help us kind of outline an approach for, explaining certain things to our kids as they're able to, wrap their head around them as they get older. The Sharp TV series is decent for those who are unfamiliar, but the books blow it out of the water. There's simply no comparison, as is often the case with, books and TV shows. It kind of goes back to that thing that I was talking about when I was outlining the Silmarillion chapter bit, where, if you can give somebody a very loose framework to follow, and then they go and read the much more detailed and elaborate version, and they get a lot more out of it, but they're able to see like where the big details that they're following in the book fall into the broader outline, that the visual format gets, and that can be the benefit of it. There are times when, the screen production of a book is wildly different from it. That's probably most readily apparent with the Longmire series, which I watched the TV show before I read any of the books. And the characters and the setting have the same names. And other than that, like the TV show is very, very different. I won't even say that it's a 180. It's heading in the same direction. It's just taking all the different roads to get there. Walt's a different character. Vic is sort of similar. Henry, there's some overlap. There are characters in the show that never existed in the books and vice versa. And that honestly, like, because I loved the show so much, that's one of the things that made it difficult for me to get into the books. But I tried reading The Cold Dish. I put it down. I went back to it a couple of years later, and it's like, all right, as long as I don't try to think of the TV show when I'm watching this, I can enjoy them both for just, very different reasons. And it's my favorite ongoing series, probably. I think the first season of Jack Reacher, which followed that Killing Floor book pretty closely, that was good execution. They changed a couple of things, which inevitably they will, just because telling a story through streaming TV, film, or whatever, it's always going to be a little bit different than in print. And they are different audiences. Like a book audience and a screen audience are different, and they expect different things, and you've got to kind of meet those expectations and satisfy them before you can try to take anything in even a remotely different direction. But yeah. I feel like there was another book series that I was going to look into next year, but really I've got a full plate, as it were. At the beginning of this year, I made a huge list of stuff that I wanted to get through. And like by the 75% mark on the year, is like, yeah, I'm actually not going to get through all of these. So I'm going to close out the stream by saying this, that I've gotten better in recent years about setting more realistic expectations for myself and being more realistic in what my own limitations are. And if the situation that I was in at the beginning of the year had stayed consistent all year long, I would have gotten a different amount of things done. However, I went on night shift schedule about 3 months into the year, and that just nuked everything. That first week that I was on the night shift, like I thought I was going to die. It was so exhausting. I was very briefly able to keep my publishing schedule intact and keep my streak alive. I've published one new piece every year since 2014. This year's was just a 10,000 word short story, but dadgummit, I did it. I work these 55-hour weeks, and my kids are getting older, and I need to be more engaged with them. So really, my writing time is getting just a little bit more and more limited every night. But I am finding ways to make it work. Sometimes I've got to choose between writing and drawing for huge stretches. And right now I'm in an illustration phase, and I'm working on the illustrations for Howling Wilderness, which I will have 2 releases next year. The print edition of Answerable Courage and Howling Wilderness, which will be an all-new book in the Engines of Liberty series. I've got to get those illustrations knocked out, and I'll get that book out, and then I will get a complete first draft written of another book. Those who used to listen to the Radcracker podcast, you'll know which one that is, but I'll talk about that more in the coming weeks here on this main channel. The second channel, I've got to get it all dialed in, and then I'll do an announcement here, and you guys can sub to it over on there. I'll get the link live on the community notes. So once again, make sure that you're sub to the channel. Thanks, BCR, for following this. We are at midnight now, so it is December 30th. I am going to go ahead and wrap this up. It's an hour and a half long at this point, and get some drawing done before I go to bed. But thank you guys for tuning in, for liking, for following, and all that. And you guys have a happy new year. And we'll check in with you again real soon. Drive safe. See you out there.